Hey everybody, welcome back to the Jodo Cast, your home for Star Wars gaming. I'm Joe, and more importantly, we've got Will Shick here from Atomic
Well,
Mass Games, and he's found his way into this little video room to answer some questions about Star Wars Legion.
I did. I did. I'm excited to be in this tiny little room of audio and video interviewing. So thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for being here. This is exciting. Um, so let's just get right into the questions I've got. There's not a whole bunch, but hopefully there will be some good information squeezed out of these. So I think it was last week already. There was a pretty, not like major, not the biggest we've ever seen, but a pretty substantial update to Legion. Lots of points changes, a bunch of new upgrades got revealed, and some of those upgrades, um, there are training upgrades that let you equip them even if your unit doesn't have the training slot. Some people were
Mhm,
asking
mhm.
if you put that upgrade on a unit that does have a training slot, does it fill that slot, or do you still get sort of like the bonus space?
Yeah, so I'm pretty sure that they confirmed this on the rules form as well. But if you equip that upgrade to a unit that has a training slot, you have to use the training slot. You can't use the invisible slot. That's only if you don't have the appropriate slot on your unit card. So the whole intention of that is really we chose that we wanted to make sure that we were able to effectively adjust or have these upgrades apply to all the units that we really wanted them to apply to. And one of the challenges with universal upgrades is there's a legacy of like some units get training slots, some don't, some get, whatever's. And at the end of the day, we were kind of confronted with the idea of like, we knew that, for example, Duggan or Duragunners, we wanted them on a host of different units that also didn't have necessarily all the same slots. And we kind of consciously made the decision that okay, in order to do that, we will utilize a not very common trick from the Legion playbook, which is to create an upgrade that can apply to units based on a specific universal rule or things like that. Um, and so that's what we did in order to make sure that we were having the greatest impact across all the different units that we wanted to see adjusted by those new upgrades.
Yeah, that's actually, I mean, it's really simple, but it's really clever as a way to. So now you can't stack this with the people who already have training slots into like
Correct. Yeah. Yeah.
comboing crazy stuff. Um, so were there specific? I think you already said yes to
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
question I'm about to ask, but were there specific units you had in mind when creating these new upgrades?
100%. I think every upgrade in the update that happened last week, they're all specifically addressing core concerns or deficiencies that we've seen repeated throughout kind of our data analysis of player feedback of all of the different stuff. And when you really get down to it, right, you can adjust points all day long, but there's this push pull where like you can make something cheaper, but if it doesn't do anything, right? Not that it doesn't function on the table, but it doesn't contribute in a meaningful way or the way in which it was maybe intended to or a way in which players want it to. Sometimes those things can be different, right? The way in which we as a development and playtesting group think something will be used or where it fits within the overall aggregate of a faction or the game of Legion at whole. Players will surprise you. They will go in different ways. They will prioritize different things or abilities based on how their metas are, based on how the global community and discourse is going. So sometimes you will find that the original design of a unit or something doesn't quite fit, or it gets kind of it gets phased out because the game continues to advance and grow. What was once good or prioritized by players or the meta is no longer that way. And so you're left with a unit that does what it does, but it doesn't really do anything meaningful within where the modern game is. These upgrades all seek to kind of identify that. So, we can lower the point cost on Empire speeder bikes by 10 points, and that does a thing. It makes them cheaper. But if that doesn't really address the fact that they're not performing the role in which we want to see them perform on the tabletop, that they are not necessarily competing well against other options that you can take in your force. So the way in which we can address that is by making an upgrade card that gives it a power that we want it to have, or something that directly impacts or addresses the thing that players are looking for from that unit. Um, and that's where you get things like, the strike and fade. You get things like strike team leader, which is specifically looking at operatives and the operative slot and how to make that a more compelling choice. And those work hand in hand with the different points adjustments that were also made, right? So now your speeders go down, but strike and fade becomes a viable choice. You combine those together, and you're still paying similar cost to the old unit, but you're getting more out of it. Alternatively, if you as a player say, well, I don't really need strike and fade to be able to execute my speeder plans, you can just take the discount. But what this opens up, this kind of two-handed approach, is it's not just about points, it's about making the units and how they play dramatically different based on what players want to get out of that unit and what they're willing to invest in those units. And so these were all designed with a very specific kind of idea in mind, with the exception of the force powers. So the new force powers, I think, they don't really necessarily target anything specifically. They are just there for more options for force users. The ones that exist in the document do kind of lean towards the non-master of the force folks. Um, Not that master of the force uh, Jedi or Sith or whatever don't want to take these, but I think you notice that only one of them exhausts. The other two, I
Hmm.
think, are just like on until you use them and that kind of thing. So, in that regard, right, those aren't necessarily trying to solve a quote unquote core issue with a unit or a unit type. Whereas the vast majority of the other ones, they're all kind of targeted to say, okay, these are things that are going to, along with points adjustments, breathe new life into more of these units, more of these play styles that we're not seeing enough of on the tabletop. And we as developers and designers want to see players be able to utilize more, because we think it leads to a more robust and interesting game environment in which players have numerous opportunities, strategies, and tactics to play with all their games, right?
So big part of this was just points balance, which my question is something I've always found interesting, because it's probably a tightrope to walk whenever you're adjusting points on units. If you had to pick, would you rather err on the side of overcosting something or undercosting something?
If you have to pick, overcosting something is always safer, right? And that is typically because if you undercost something and it is extremely efficient, even if something is slightly more efficient than the other things within its class or within its faction, right? It's exponential in terms of how much more efficient it becomes, the lower, like the more undercosted it is. And I think you see that repeatedly with things like ARC Troopers with Sleeper Cell. Um, those options, they're so strong, and then if they come at a substantial points level at which they are also competing really well with the things that aren't as strong as them, they kind of become a de facto choice. And it's really hard as a player to justify, even though you might say, well, the balance of these things, like, yeah, they're a little bit better, but now we're dealing with these, what can I fit into my army, and I'm trying to maximize my efficiency across everything. So if you're just simply stronger and you're undercosted and I can take multiples of you, that becomes a compounding issue. I think where you can be very safe on undercosting is when something is limited, right? When you can only take one of something. And this really reflects in how the operatives like Ahsoka and Asajj got significantly deep cuts to their points. And some might say, well, that's really aggressive. And the answer would be yes, it is aggressive, but it's part and parcel of, we want to see more operatives on the table. We want to see, as we've talked about since the start of all of the discussion around the revamp and refresh of Legion, moving into this new edition last year, we want to see more characters on the table. We want to give Legion players more opportunity to play with the iconic characters. That brings us all into the franchise and the galaxy that we love. So there's a number of different determining factors that are going into that points cut. But at the end of the day, from a development standpoint, it's like, well, you can push a little harder on a one of, because even if that one of is really, really good, it can't make a whole army. But if you make a core unit of which you can take six, really, really good, and they're undercosted, now it's just like you're just doubling your fun, right? So overall, the safer bet is always to go slightly over the cost on things that you can take multiples of, because in that way, right, if they do happen to be the best in class, you're paying the premium for them. This can obviously be a double-edged sword, because if you say, well, you overcosted this thing and it doesn't do a lot on the table, now all of a sudden it's like it's also exponentially worse again. So the goal is always to hit that sweet spot of perfectly costed, compared to everything else that's within the faction, all of the play value that it gives a player, all of that stuff. But that target is, of course, it's somewhat moving, because the meta and the way in which players again are approaching the game, looking and valuing certain abilities, might not be the way in which we think they're thinking about it, or the way in which we are thinking about it at the time. And then something can shift within a meta, and all of a sudden these things become more powerful and nobody expected it. And so this is where these kind of dynamic adjustments and rebalances can be really effective. They allow us to go in and make adjustments, sometimes dramatically, sometimes incrementally, to try to push things more towards that perfectly imbalanced like state that these games want to be. And I say perfectly imbalanced because the game will never be perfectly balanced. It's not going to happen, because you have different values for all these different things. And so the second that you have different values, especially within a faction, there's now clearly a best and a worst. And our goal is to push the band, or the curve of that balance, as close as possible, to where something at the bottom end can still outperform through player expression and skill, through a little bit of dice luck, etc. Something that's at the top end, assuming that all the variables are the same, outside of those couple of other like elements, right? And so if you get that, then what you really have is a healthy, balanced, imperfectly balanced game.
That's given me the dumbest idea possible.
Uh-oh, I like it.
Not that, like, you had an amazing answer and my brain went, picture this, you're going to hate this. A system where there's like a stock market of every unit, and you every day you check and see the point
Ooh,
value
yeah,
going up and down.
where the ticker is, we just live Wolf of Wall Street style.
Yeah, like, oh, the rebel troopers are down 5 points. Put them in your
You
list today. Go, go, go.
you absolutely gave Pagani a significant panic attack, because I think that is his biggest terror. Um,
That sounds like a nightmare on both the player side and especially, obviously, the
it would
developer side.
certainly make events quite interesting when day one of a big convention event your list is legal, and then day two you're like either over or under by 30 points.
Like, maybe I gotta wait 30 more minutes. Maybe it'll
Yeah,
switch when the
you'd be
bell
like,
dings or
I'm
whatever.
not going to turn in my list just yet. See, that's probably the juice, is that once you turn in the list, it doesn't matter where the points go. Like, it's locked in. You just got to lock in your bid. So you're like, you got people waiting 30 seconds before the event. Sounds
Yeah,
awful, but at the
that
same time, very exciting.
that's really extrapolating. A thing that you did away with was the points bid,
Yes,
which was an
a little
element of
bit.
the game that I did not like at all, and I'm happy to see it gone. But um, so, how do you go about gathering the data to make these kinds of balanced decisions? So, obviously, there must be a lot of thought that goes into this. So, how do what avenues do you consider, and how do you gather all of the information needed to make informed decisions here?
We try to take data from every single spot that is possible. So we look at big event results. We look at UKGE, we look at Adepticon. Obviously, we look at all of the GTs, we look at LVO. We look at all of these different, popular events that bring a wide variety of players globally to them. And you can track a lot of that data, because folks they use a different tournament organizing software and those kinds of things. So those results are really easy to pull. um, However, tournament and competitive results only give you a slice of the picture, right? Because again, what you're looking at there is you have to assume that that data is skewed, and it's skewed towards the most efficient options possible, because that's what we don't know, right? I think a lot of players go to these events and they say, well, I'm just going to have a good time. I just want to play some games. I'm going to play a list that I like, and I'm going to win, lose, whatever. It doesn't matter, right? I'm just there to play some Legion. And I'm not discounting, that happens a lot. But as when you're looking at data like that and you're saying, okay, what kind of analysis are we going to pull from it? We kind of have to make some assumptions about the vast majority of players. And we assume if you're going to a tournament, your goal is to win said tournament. Now that's not always true, right? I was certainly one of those players who I would go to tournaments at like Gen Con or Adepticon or whatever, and I would say, well, I don't expect to win. I don't plan to make day one cut. I
Yeah,
just want to play
my
some
goal
games
is
and have fun.
always let's see if I can win one game.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
always
Like
my goal at Legion Worlds. Like,
so,
if I can get one
sometimes
game, I'll be proud.
sometimes that's the way it goes, but I think the intention is still there, right? Like you go in there, and if you're going to an event, your goal ultimately is to try to win the event, even if you may put different percentages on the likelihood of it. So our assumption when we look at the data is people are choosing things effectively based on what they think will give them the best opportunity to win, to come out on top and to make day two cuts or to make worlds or to become the world champion, or the GT champion or whatever. So that is a slice of the pie, but I think more important, right? Because it is just a slice. It's not every player who plays Legion, not every person who picks up the game, not every player who plays in the local game store on game night is looking at the game that way, right? A lot of them are looking at it. More of them, I think, than not, are looking at it the way you and I just talked about looking at it. Going in to play some games with some units that we really like, trying to see success, but not necessarily worried about coming out on top. And so that data comes a lot from like Discord chatter, from discussions, from podcasts like you have. We're pretty voracious when it comes to trying to pull in every single bit of data we possibly can get. We have good data that comes back from some of our retailers. We do get after actions from a lot of the different conventions that run GTs. We ask what side events were popular. We ask like what kind of distribution of lists we had, what kind of factions, those kinds of things. So we're trying to pull in everything because what we want to do is we want to analyze what is holistically great for the game. We're not designing or developing any of Legion purely from a competitive standpoint. That is not the goal. Because if it was, then every single release that came out would have to be better than the last one, right? Because the only way that it's designed well for a competitive environment is if you say, okay, well, this thing's currently the best. This now has to be the best. And you run into this voracious cycle where everything is either the best in class or it's forgotten and left behind because a true competitive player analyzes the game that way. It's just the way it works. You might play other things just because you like them, but at the end of the day, if you're saying I'm designing from a competitive standpoint, then everything has to be the best because that's what makes it competitive. Miniatures games in general, but especially like games like Legion and stuff, right? They have a host more ways of approaching them and enjoying them than just the competitive side. So what we're looking at is what makes the best game. And in our view, in our experience, if you make a great game, great quote unquote casual game, right? It will be a great competitive game because all of your bases are covered. Like if you have good internal balance within the game, you've made a great competitive game because there are lots of different options, there are lots of different list builds, yada yada yada. If you make clear and concise rules that are easily understandable and don't require a lot of like FAQ lookups or a lot of rulebook checking, which is fantastic from a casual environment because we as casual players don't like, you don't want to get yourself lost in a rulebook trying to be like, I don't understand how this works, and this is here and I have to go to this appendix and I have to look at this and then I have to go onto the forums to figure it out. Like that's what you really want to avoid, because most players who are just approaching the game for fun, they're not going to do that because that's not fun, right? That's homework. But if you can have clear and concise and strong rules, obviously your game plays really well at tournaments. There are less judge calls. Like people feel like they're getting a fair shake and all of this stuff. That's and so that's what we're trying to do when we aggregate all this data. We're saying, we're not saying, oh, riot control troopers, for instance, are not making it into grand tournament lists, right? What we're looking at is we're saying, okay, they're not in grand tournament lists, but also we see a consistent like discussion and discourse within the community at large from every level of player that they just don't perform in a way that works within the set of the game, like within the meta of the game. And they really want them to. They want to be able to utilize this cool new unit and they want to see success with it. But the ways in which you can see success are either very niche and you have to build specifically like SKU lists to realize it, or they just can't compete well. They're off the curve, right? We talk about that tight little balance curve. They're off the curve. And we can see that through all these different places. So in that instance, right, with Riot Troopers specifically, you go in and you say, okay, well, what can we do to adjust them? And part of that was points. They got a pretty aggressive points reduction between both the KX droids and the base unit. But we also went in and added the Imperial March, which is a upgrade card that obviously can benefit them. if you as a player decide that that's a value you want over tenacity. That card also boosts all of the Empire core units, which was a big push as well, was giving more life into what is supposed to be an identifying facet of the Imperial faction, which is that the core units are the bulk of the army, and the special forces and support and the heavy, slots are the support, right? They're not, unlike in Rebels or maybe you could argue Republic, the special forces are not kind of what the core of the army is built around. With Empire, we want to see those big blocks of stormtroopers and the common trooper type from the core, and then we want to see like scout troopers supporting them, range troopers supporting them, et cetera, et cetera. So those are really kind of what we're looking at when we're talking about that stuff, and we're trying to analyze the data that we have. And the challenge is taking all the data and saying, okay, riot troopers aren't doing super well, speeder bikes aren't particularly great, people don't like prepared position units. Why? And then what can we do to adjust those things and bring them more in line with the way in which players want to see them play, in which the value is apparent to players when they're building their armies, so that they have more choice, so they're not always going back to the well of, well, these are the clearly the most efficient choices, right? If we can blur the lines between what is the most efficient choice and what is not, then we're doing our jobs very well, because players can make that analysis for themselves based on how they like to play, based on which upgrades they want to take, based on which characters they want to take, all of those different things. We want to see that synergy matter almost as much as just the core analysis of each individual unit as a building block of itself.
That's great. And that leads into the last question on my list, but it's going to bump up a few slots here, which is so we just got, like you said, a faction specific upgrade, Imperial March. Great name, very thematic name. Should we expect other factions to get something similar, or was this sort of like a one off to help out the Empire?
As far as faction specific kind of upgrades and all of that, I think those 12 upgrades that were dropped alongside the points adjustment ideally are a good view into how we, as a design and development team at AMG, want to utilize universal upgrades going forward, right? We made the decision with the revamp and the re-update and all that stuff, which we talked about, to remove universal upgrades from each of the different unit boxes. We did that for a number of reasons, but one of the strongest ones from the game development side was because by removing them, we don't have to hold ourselves to a certain quota, right? We don't have to say, well, we need 3 universal upgrades to go into this box, because every box gets at least 3 universal upgrades. So we can either take ones that already exist and give you more of the same, or we can try to come up with some new ones, and maybe they'll be interesting or maybe they won't, but whatever, right? And we'll probably err on the side of just making them not particularly impactful, because universal upgrades are pretty dangerous given that they can go in a lot of different spots. So they are complicated and difficult to balance. And this kind of goes back, if you look at the original upgrade cards, they're pretty simple, right? They give you a keyword, or they have a very like short ability that they do. They might give you a new weapon that has like a new dice pool or whatever, but they don't necessarily add significantly to the way in which a unit functions, like in a way that's outside of the norm, right? Like obviously adding a keyword like sharpshooter 1 can have a huge impact based on the unit, but it's not quite the same effect like strike team leader, like Imperial March and some of the other ones that you saw in the last bucket. And this partially is us moving to that larger card. We've talked a lot about how going to the full size LCG card and also losing the art has provided us more room to do more interesting things and to really dive into what an upgrade card can do and how we can affect and change the way in which players approach these different units to provide more interesting and exciting options for players as they build their armies. And I think the other part to that too is that we have the ability to take more time with these things, because they're not tied to a unit's release. They're not tied to a specific cycle. With the upgrade card pack that comes out next year, of which these 12 cards that were shown off last week are a part of, we're able to design that thing, to design those cards, to design that card pack as its own product based on its own development timeline, which means we can take a lot more care, consideration, and time in trying to make sure that every card that's in that pack is impactful and interesting and exciting and brings these new opportunities to things, whether that's across the game or within a faction as a a universal faction upgrade, rather than like truly being universal and going across the whole scope of the game. And I think that's really exciting, right? And so, will we see more of like Imperial March cards? I would say yes, right? That's the goal. The goal is to see more cards that add more to both units that are underperforming and need a boost, but also that create situations where players are put into fun consideration, right? Our view on the games is that one of the most enjoyable aspects of them should be the list building portion. And what that means is that you as a player are making hard choices about what to include and what not to include. And the choices that you make directly impact how your army functions on the tabletop, therefore making it a unique expression of you as the player. All of those things tie back into, how we're moving forward with upgrade card design, what and how the content of those cards is being written and developed and all of that. And I think it's very exciting to be able to go in and say, okay, let's make a card that's going to boost Imperial Core units because that's what we want to see. And then also be able to do something that's like, let's boost all speeder bikes because we know speeders don't just need a points increase. They need to do something meaningful on the table. And through all of our data analysis and playtest and everything else, we've kind of locked into, okay, we thought they would do this. They're not quite efficient enough at it. So we can give them this upgrade card that boosts their ability to do what we want to see speeder bikes do on the table, and how that will make them into a viable and exciting option for players to consider when building their armies.
So how much of this update, so the points balance and the new upgrades, kind of one lump
Mhm.
update, how much of it is based on internal balance? So like within each army, so like stormtrooper versus scout trooper versus external balance, so empire versus rebels. Yeah.
It's a combination of both, honestly, and that's one of the bigger challenges in terms of doing a game like Legion is that you have two different kind of zones that you have to pay attention to. I think we always start largely with the holistic view, like making sure that the game itself at whole is balanced so that all of the factions have viable builds, that a player can come to any faction in the game based on their preference and see success with it. And that when we sit down at the table, there's no one like faction or army build that is just going to steamroll everything in its path. Right. Again, going back to choice being the ultimate kind of consideration for how we want the game to function, that you as a player get to make choices. And then you move down from that holistic balance into faction balance and internal faction balance. And I think that's obviously where there are certainly factions that have moved further towards internal balance with the last update and every iteration since. There are factions that still have some discrepancies within their internal balance, and those, ideally will be solved potentially with additional resources coming in from, new units, new characters, new command cards, new missions, things like that. Alternatively, it may come through continuous points iterations, new upgrade cards, and those kinds of things. But the internal faction balance, while very important, is secondary to making sure the game at whole is functional, fun, and enjoyable. Because, as difficult as it is to say this, or, you know, having a few units within each faction, if that's the price to pay for a healthy and overall balanced game, it's a sacrifice that I think we're willing to make, or at least be like, okay, well, we'll accept that for now and we'll work on it later, because we have a very strong foundation to work from. If we had great internal faction balance, but three factions just can't beat one of the other factions, right? If for whatever reason Rebels was the top and Rebels just steamrolled all the other three factions, but within the factions themselves, you're like, well, everything's pretty well balanced. I don't think that's a player environment that most players would be willing to accept, and they shouldn't, right? Because the game doesn't happen within the internal faction. The game happens within all of the factions competing on the tabletop together. Um, so it goes back to that we want players to have choice. We want them to have meaningful choice. We want them to be able to express themselves in whatever way they want possible. Having access to all the units within your faction is a way to do that. So obviously internal faction balance is important, but it is not where we start. It's kind of where we want to end up, as we move through, making sure, first of all, everything is not going to break the whole game and the whole game is healthy and happy and exciting. Then we get into the factions themselves and get into the nitty gritty of each individual unit and how it stacks up against each other. And I think that, that's overall why we're still on this path of moving the internal faction balance forward into a much better place. Because with the whole revamp and the refresh, right, we definitely did our best to make sure that internally all of the new units, all of the things that existed were as balanced against each other as possible. But we were also primarily focused with making sure that all of the changes that happened to those units to make them interesting jived with the major rules overhauls that we were doing for cover, for missions, for the points adjustment to how big army sizes were, and all of these different aspects. So it is definitely a balancing act. It's a tricky line to walk.
So this question, here's one from the community. Just hoping for some clarification or some, uh, basically, is there an updated release date for the new starters and card packs, or are they still on schedule with the timeline that was laid out at Adepticon?
As far as I'm aware, um, there have been no changes to timeline.
Okay.
So I believe that we're still on track. However, we as the studio don't control any of the logistics for the shipping.
Mm.
We get notified from our publisher, Asmodee, who does all of the physical print production, manufacturing, and distribution across the globe. So, like, really, we never have any hands-on sort of with the physical products. We review them and approve like bulk samples and stuff, but all of that is done through the publishing and distribution wing of Asmodee itself, um, which means that a lot of the times when there are delays or hiccups or there's pirates in a canal somewhere like shooting rockets at a ship and they have to go around the South Cape of Africa, we'll get told that through kind of communication. They'll be like, hey, we're delaying this here because of this reason, or this has impacted whatever. So currently, I have not been informed or told of any delay to this point. That doesn't mean there won't be one that happens, but when and if that does occur, that will be made clear to everyone as we learn of the information ourselves as well.
Is Mini Stravaganza happening this summer?
Not this summer. So we are moving the date to fall, kind of to better line up with some of the plans and things that we have. I don't have an official date yet. I'm sure that the marketing folks will be announcing that at some point, hopefully before the end of August, but I imagine it might happen a little sooner. But yeah, traditionally in years past, we typically did it in August, September. Last year we put it before Gen Con because of a few different reasons and considerations of things that we wanted to announce and show off and all that stuff. But we have moved it back more to its traditional roots, so it should be around fall, which gives us the opportunity to do some pretty cool things around the Legion release and some announcements there, and it also times it better against the Adepticon announcements and everything as well, so that we have more new stuff that we get to cover at each of those different things. So that's my info on that at the time. As far as I'm aware, it's still on, and I've been told that it'll be a fall show.
Nice. Um, that is all of the Legion questions I have. If
Mm,
you remember our,
easy peasy.
I mean, unless if there's more that you're like, why didn't you ask this? We should talk about this. Feel free to ask yourself a question and then answer it.
I
But
have I have no questions to ask myself at this time.
um, if you remember our interview at Adepticon, I had a little dumb book of
Yes,
Star Wars conversation cards, and I
I
have
remember.
another question that I pulled from that. Um, if you were a Star Wars action figure, what accessories would be included in your box?
Oh my gosh. Okay. If I was a Star Wars action figure, what accessories would be included in my box? There would probably have to be some like a hobby toolkit like paintbrushes and some stuff.
Does
I drag
the
those around.
come unpainted?
Yeah, probably. No, it's fine. So I'd have my little like hobby toolkit. I would definitely need that. I would like to think that I would come with some kind of cool lightsaber. That would be neat. I don't know if they'd give me one, but I assume just because I get a pick, like I'm gonna pick lightsaber, even if it's just like a little one to cut little miniatures off frames or something. I don't know,
Yes.
but that
The
would be pretty
sprue
neat.
clipping
Yeah,
lightsaber.
and then ideally, let's see, if we're being real about it, I would probably come with some kind of cooking thing, because I do quite a bit of like cooking in my off time. So maybe like a little grill or something, some spatulas and things, like some burgers to
Like
flip.
there's a
Ronto wrap. Yeah,
pancake
yeah,
flipping
yeah.
droid in
There
Attack
you
of the
go.
Clones, and I think it was also
You do that.
in Book of Boba Fett,
Mm-hmm,
but
mm-hmm.
in that one it was twirling meat cleavers or something.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
you,
yeah. When he
you
fights it in the kitchen. Yep,
yeah, you
yep.
come packaged with like a droid companion, like
There
some of
you
the more
go.
deluxe kits have.
Yeah, I'd be into
Which
that. I'd be into that. That would cover me pretty well. Alternatively, I mean, if I get like little like minion accessories, I could get a bunch of the pit droids, and they could
mm.
represent the dev team, and they just run around and fix things. Like
And you kick him in the nose when they
yeah,
screw up.
I just boop them. Man, that'd be great if I could just boop them and they just shut. Like when they get real lippy, it just be like boop, like
Hit the nose.
little poke on the nose, and they just turn into a little disc that I can like put on a shelf. I don't think that's the world we want, but there are times where I would definitely utilize it. I'd just be like, we're done, boop, and then I put them on the shelf until tomorrow.
I mean, you could try. I don't know if they'll collapse, but you can try the nose boop and see what happens.
It's very
We
difficult. We do most of our meetings online, so
Oh,
because
okay.
in office we're playtesting. I don't think I'd boop anybody during playtest, but certainly during a meeting. I mean, it'd be kind of fun to just be like, boop, we're just done.
Well, that is all of the questions we've got for you today.
Perfect.
Always an absolute pleasure to hear you talk
Yeah.
about game design. Obviously, the
Yeah.
games we love in general, but just anytime I get to hear Will Shick just brain dump about game design things is a good day for me.
Yeah. Well,
So very grateful to have you here. Always
absolutely.
a good
Thank you
time.
so much for having me. I super appreciate it. All the work that you do putting into the cast, and informing the community and just being a positive force for it. So we're very appreciative of all you do. So thanks so much for having me.
Gonna bust out the little soundboard at the end there. All right, everybody. If you like that, be sure to go play Legion, because normally this is where I'd say, "Oh, hey, go check out such and such's podcast," but in this case, I say, "Oh, go buy and play Legion," and then that's how you support
There
Will
you
here.
go. I love it. I love it.
All right, everybody. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you. I was gonna say next time, but just another time. We don't have
There
a
you
great
go.
consistent schedule, so thanks, everybody. Thanks, Will. Great having you.
Thank you.